Good afternoon, everyone. It is fabulous to be here. My name is Adam Gelb. I'm founder and president and CEO of an organization called the Council on Criminal Justice. And I'm thrilled to be having this conversation and really appreciate ASC setting it up this way, having this theme for the event overall, and having this discussion about where the evidence might take us, and that is how we can, frankly, increase the influence and credibility of criminology in the policy arena. I'm fascinated by it because it's what I've been doing my whole life in federal government and a couple of different state governments, at a small nonprofit, at a large nonprofit, the Pew Charitable Trust, and starting my career here in Atlanta back in the 80s as the police reporter. And so that's what I've been doing my whole life. I have some insights on this, but it's really my honor today to be moderating this discussion. And we're going to do it as a discussion with three people who live and breathe it every day here: Robin Engel, Thad Johnson, and Thomas Abt. We're in the midst of a serious rebalancing, rethinking of the role of research in the making of criminal justice policy. Some sort of even existential, fundamental type questions are on the table. What is even public safety? How do we define that? What is equitable justice? What even is evidence? And what should count in making policy? Whose voices should be heard? And so I'm just going to go ahead and kick us straight into gear with I think a question that hopefully will dramatize what's at stake here. And that is, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give their best example, either from their own research or from something else that they're aware of in their careers. What's your best example of a situation where research actually did break through and did influence policy and practice? What were the barriers that you encountered? How did you break through? What happened that made this difference? And let's start with Robin.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for all of you being here today. And so I clearly misunderstood the assignment because I have, and any of you who know me, of course, it's at least not a cocktail napkin. It is actually a piece of paper that I wrote in pencil that I now cannot read. So I'm literally going to go just off the top of my head here and tell you a little bit about myself and why I think that the study that I'll talk about briefly had the impact that it has. So again, I'm Robin Engel. I am now newly with the National Policing Institute, new senior vice president there. So this is my first time at ASC since I was a grad student in 1992. This is my first ASC meeting without an academic affiliation. And boy, it feels free. Let me tell you. You ought to try it sometime. It's really something. But what we do, for those of you who are not familiar with the National Policing Institute, it's formerly the Police Foundation. Everyone knows it as the Police Foundation, right? We've just rebranded and renamed, but we're a group of researchers and scientists and practitioners that really work towards enhancing science and innovation in the field to better law enforcement and to make our communities safer. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, and non-membership group. So I now represent them, but I have to now have the caveat of anything that I say is not really attributable to them. Right? So bear with me. The study that I'm going to tell you about that I think has had impact is one of my own that I worked on with Nick Corsaro and Gabrielle Izaza and Hannah McManus when we were all together at the University of Cincinnati. And that is the Louisville Metro police study where we looked at de-escalation training. And in order to tell you why I think this study has had such impact and why it continues to have impact, I need to bring you back just a little bit into my personal career. When I was at the University of Cincinnati in 2015, many of you know this story. We had an officer-involved killing of an unarmed black motorist at the university by a campus law enforcement officer. And so in 2015, I literally found myself almost overnight thrust into the national spotlight because I recommended and then accepted a position of vice president for safety and reform at the university, where I had to take over the police department. And as part of that, I had to deal with the short-term crisis, but also long-term planning for reform. We had about 70 sworn officers or so. And so I, for the 3.5 years thereafter, spent all of my time thinking about police reform and how do we implement for the short term and the long term to make our police interactions in our communities safer. And so I thought, well, I'm a researcher. This should be easy. I'm going to go to the evidence, and I'm going to do everything evidence-based. And I very quickly realized that the Academy has not really been a strong partner for policy-based research. Because the truth was, when I went to the evidence, it wasn't there for the most part. Most of the most relevant and important questions that I needed to handle as a police executive, there was no evidence. And when there was evidence, it was very slim, and it wasn't readily accessible or available. And so the law enforcement executives also didn't have access to this. After that experience, I decided, you know what, I'm going to change this. I really want to have impact in the field because I don't want another police executive to sit in my seat and not be able to do evidence-based practices. And so that's where the Louisville Metro study came in. And I'm so proud that we have at least two or more from the Louisville Metro Police Department here at ASC with us. And I'll just tell you, they were great partners. And what we ended up doing was looking at their de-escalation training. When they put in place de-escalation training, and as we all know, police reformists across the country are demanding different changes for policing, including changes to police training. The de-escalation training, at the time, we knew absolutely nothing about whether or not it was effective. And we also knew that there was backlash among the officers that you're going to get me killed out there because you're going to teach me to hesitate. You're going to teach me to slow down rather than go in and handle a situation. And you're going to get me killed. And there was no evidence to suggest otherwise. So what we did with the Louisville Metro Police Department, and why I think this study broke through, was because we had a very strong research design. We did a quasi-experimental design, a randomized controlled trial of sorts, a step wedge design. But the most important part about the study breaking through and really having impact in the field is the way that it was disseminated. So that study was put out as an agency report. It was picked up by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It has 33,000 members in 165 countries, I think, around the world. So they picked it up, and so did the Police Executive Research Forum, which has another 3,000 or so police executive members. The media did pick it up after a little bit. That took a little coaxing to get them there. But the findings themselves showed that de-escalation training actually had a significant reduction in officer injuries and citizen injuries. And so for the first time, we could really speak to both audiences, if you will, with a particular research study that demonstrated positive impact on both areas of concern, reducing citizen injuries and officer injuries. And so it was an easy story to tell from that perspective, and it continues to be disseminated. In fact, the Council on Criminal Justice just yesterday released a one-page summary of it yet again, and so it's reintroducing itself into the field. I have had law enforcement executives from all over the country contact me, come up to me, find me at meetings, wanting to know more, wanting to do this type of research in their own agencies. We have been flooded by requests to evaluate training, which was something that we never really heard from law enforcement before. So I'm really excited about that work.
Congratulations on that, Robin. Thad, over to you.
I'm Thad Johnson. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia State University, so I'm part of the academy, but I'm a Harvard. I also work with the Council on Criminal Justice. And I've been in the blessed opportunity to see my research reach beyond our academic audience. Before I talk about, I'm going to kind of give a quick purview or tour of some studies, because it's not necessarily one study. It's how I take my research, take my lens, and you all's research, and I distill the information for people on the ground. So if any of you all are visually impaired, I'm a 6-foot tall black guy with dreadlocks. from Memphis, Tennessee. I'm a former interim police captain in Memphis, Tennessee. I never arrested anybody that didn't look like me. And so my motivation and how I break through policy is that my lens and my audience is different. No disrespect, but the academy is not my audience. And this is why I say that, and I will talk about this. Who is our work for? These studies that, and we say, what is research? Is research a 40-page peer-reviewed journal article, or is it a research-informed piece that people outside this room can understand? And so no one has ever clicked on my CRIM study link or my link in Government Information Quarterly, and or they'll come behind that dreaded paywall. But it's from op-eds, it's from research briefs, it's from getting up from behind my ivory desk and the comforts of that and going out and meeting people where they're at. I don't expect them to come find me. It's my job to go find them. And so that's my target. That's my emphasis. That's my focus. And so with that being said, you want to talk about our reach, and then I'll talk about the studies. This is beyond, I can't even keep up with the work that we've done and the media exposure and how many readers we've had, but just Natasha, my wife, and I, just in the op-ed pieces that we've done, maybe 9 or 10 pieces, at minimum, we've reached 150 to 250,000 people who've read our work. And so we hadn't really had to go out and fish for opportunities. We pub in places they can find us. And so research that we've done on, we talk about policy. Policy is not at the government level. We've done work, microaggressions and racial equity work, churches, and how they were reaching out to communities. They realized why they wouldn't get a response back because it wasn't informed, right? It was a white church in Minneapolis, and George Floyd was going on, and why they couldn't get traction. And so impacted policies and processes just with nonprofits and churches on the ground. We also talk about the work that done with the Council on Criminal Justice on racial disparities and imprisonment and state imprisonment. And let me say this. I'm a newly minted academic. I got gray hair, I'm an old guy, right? But I'm a newly academic, and I've been doing this for 2 years now. And so I'm just starting to see the research really take hold and having these conversations. And so just at the end of this month, we're going to go and talk to the Correctional Leaders Association about our research at the national level, but also our research at the state level. And part of it is we've been able to break through because we've involved these stakeholders. Hell, we've even published a paper with a practitioner, right? So they can be involved in part of these things. And so with our research on police education, facial recognition technologies, arrest disparities, use of force, police reward structures, just right now we're working with an agency in Texas, a large agency in Texas, because they're having problems recruiting, particularly recruiting people of color. They're having problems with retention. They're having problems with fair promotion. And so we're actually in talks right now, how can we revamp your police evaluation systems? So if you're doing community policing, shouldn't you be rewarded for it? That hasn't always matched up. And so that's one of the things that we're actually working on right now. And so I will say that it really broke through because we focused on the audience we wanted to reach. You still get pubbed in journals, but your work is much broader, and we get behind those stinky paywalls. I've even sent policymakers, decision makers, my rough drafts, my accepted copies of my paper because of the paywall. And so we have to figure out how to reach those. When I was a police captain, I trained officers in use of force, deadly force, officer survival tactics. I didn't know a damn thing about a criminology journal or any journal. I never read one. And so that's still going on. And so the thing is meeting them where they're at, getting from behind our desk, and making our work matter, right? Doing work not for tenure, doing work for change. And those are just some of the ways and how we've been able to break through by using the media, not running from interviews. You get an interview, I don't care if it's right ring, left ring, in the middle, top ring, we're going to talk and we're going to distill truth. And so it's just really being open and being focused and being very targeted and specific in how we've been able to break through with some of our work.
Thank you, Thad. Thomas, you've also been a practitioner and bring a practitioner sensibility to this understanding of what's able to reach through to practitioners and policymakers. Go ahead.
Sure. So I guess a bit about me. I'm a former prosecutor in New York City, then former white-collar defense attorney, then former election lawyer, then former chief of staff to the Office of Justice Programs, former head of public safety to New York State, former senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and now current senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice. Actually, I've just recently joined the faculty at the University of Maryland, starting a new center called the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction. And so my career has been 1 foot in academia, 1 foot in practice and policy. And I have some observations based on that. But I want to take this, I also, no one has actually yet said what the Council on Criminal Justice does, which is who brought us all together here. And I think it's important to just say out loud, you know, the Council is a membership body and a think tank. And I think the goal is, as you know, Adam, it's your vision, but I think is to really create sort of a center of gravity in the criminal justice conversation that is nonpartisan and based on facts and evidence, with a explicit policy focus. So informed by the most rigorous information we have, but really intended to make that information actionable.
Thank you for that.
No worries. But I'm going to take my answer in a little bit of a different direction and not really focus on my own work so much. I think generally speaking, the most powerful examples of research impacting policy are works of synthesis, reports from the National Academy, systematic reviews from the Campbell collaboration. I think that policymakers are generally reluctant, as they should be, to rely on the results of a single study or the work of a single researcher, no matter how good that study or the work might be. And there's some powerful examples of this. One is a somewhat negative example. In 1975, Robert Martinson co-published or co-authored a survey of rehabilitation programs and had a conclusion that, quote, unquote, nothing works. That came at a critical moment in the policy and arena and really helped usher in a sort of an era of tough on crime that we're still reckoning with today. On the positive side, in 1998, Larry Sherman and others published What Works, What Doesn't, What's Promising, which was a sort of interesting hybrid report to Congress, as well as other things. And that really, in many ways, ushered in this whole sort of era of practical rigor on focus on impact evaluation in criminology, and sort of opened the door for this sort of policy conversation back and forth between government and the academy. In my area, systematic reviews of hotspots policing, focused deterrence, and cognitive behavioral therapy have all been influential in confirming for policymakers that these strategies are in fact worthy of public investment. And I think this has sort of important implications for all of us who are in the academy. Our work is often solitary when it should be more collaborative. It's often focused on novelty when it should be more iterative, meaning building on what came before. And we need a greater appreciation that knowledge building is really a collective endeavor. I think that in criminology and in other areas, systematic reviews, often featuring meta-analyses, are now preferred over traditional literature reviews because they have transparent, testable, and replicable methods. And what I'd like to see, particularly in the area of impact evaluation, is for researchers to be designing their studies with anticipating that their work will be aggregated and synthesized in a rigorous way. And I'd like to see funders insist on this in their solicitations. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Thomas. I tried to get all three of you to give us one specific example. I was highly unsuccessful in doing that. So rather than put you on the spot further on that one question, though, Robin, thank you very much for picking that one example. It was very rich in a number of different ways. I guess what I would pull out from this is that throughout my career and now with what we're doing at CCJ, if there's a common refrain about research and researchers, it's why are decision makers, why are policymakers, practitioners not listening to us? They keep not listening to us, and if they would just listen to us, we'd be in much better shape. We'd have less crime, we'd have less incarceration. And so I want to ask the panel, why do you think that is? I think at some level, I think we should acknowledge that there are plenty of people in this community who are happy to not influence policy. Then there are others who, like you all, who spent your careers trying to inject research into policy. And then maybe there's a middle group who would really like to do that, but not sort of sure how to do it or how best to do it. There are so many sort of well-worn, I think, analyses of sort of why the incentives are not right in academia for reaching a policy audience. Let me try again with this one. What do you think is the biggest or among your top list of impediments and barriers for research having impact on policy and practice?
Well, I'll jump in and get in trouble right now, all right? This may be my last presidential panel, but that's okay. I'm going to make it real good. So I will say that it's a lot of work. If you're an academic, you have certain benchmarks you have to hit. Service. And oftentimes the service that you may deem important is not what you're being evaluated on. If you don't pub in a top peer-reviewed journal, some things are not necessarily considered to be research. And then when you think about, for instance, I spend 40 hours a week doing my Georgia State job. I spend another 20, 30 hours a week working with the Council on Criminal Justice, pushing this work out there, reaching communities. That's not sustainable. And so we have to realize that we can only do so much and that people have different talents. Now, let me give you a prime example. If we look around this room, I only see a couple people that look like me. And we talk about social justice and why we're not necessarily impacting the communities that often look like me. It's because oftentimes, if you think about it, only 5% of assistant professors on the tenure track are black. We should get to the full level, only 4%, 2% black men and 2% black women. Now, if you think about social justice theory, what it says is you have certain tenets, but it also says people who have certain lived experiences, they embody these tenets, right? And not that you can't come from another group. I'm not saying that, not at all, because you need all voices. But I'm saying there's actually a missing link there. And so part of the reason why we see that attrition with professors of color is that the service that we value is not valued often by universities. I'll give you a prime example, and I'm going to shut up. I don't see my chair in here. But I remember when when the mass shooting in Memphis a couple months ago. And then we also had the jogger who was murdered. And then I have to go answer and attend the meeting. Well, I won't even say. But I deemed it not to be important in that moment. It didn't fit the moment. What I wanted to do was call my fellow police officers in Memphis, people that I've been working with, and say, this is what we need to do. But guess what? I didn't have the time. And that work, while you get an attaboy, it's not necessarily counts toward the meat of your tenure and promotion. Now, last thing, and I shut up. You talk about diversity of voices and why that's important. If you don't support those people in those positions who may be well suited to do the work and reach out, then we'll never create that pipeline that we're looking for. And if we create that pipeline that we're looking for, what would this room look like 5 years from now? And so I think the incentive structure on what academia is important often mismatches what it takes to impact policy. And we're only human. And so that's a big barrier that I see of why our work hasn't been making it. And oftentimes, we don't call practitioners in, we call them out. And I think we need to do a better job in our research of calling them in and not calling them out and getting over ourselves. And I will shut up.
But whoever wants to go next, I just want to prompt a little bit more, because honestly, as much of a new perspective that as you bring to that, we could have had the same conversation 30 years ago, and it's still not changed. Right, the incentives are not there for you to write an op-ed. That doesn't help. You have to do that on your extra time. So why is that?
Well,
Go ahead, Rob.
I'll take that on. Why that is. I work in police organizations. What gets done is what's measured, right? What you count, that's what happens. So in law enforcement circles, you get an activity measure of arrest. Why do you think arrests go up? We count them, right? And then we put them and we display them and we talk about them. For academics, what do we count? And how do we quantify it? We count peer-reviewed publications that sit behind a paywall. That is how we count. We don't count op-eds. Does anyone even actually put that on their vita? And if they do, does it count for anything when you go up for tenure? No, it doesn't. In fact, for some academics, it's considered a distraction, and it's actually suggested not to do that. Let's be honest about our discipline. Right now, I might get kicked out too.
No, good. We'll do it together.
Okay, you ready? Right now, I think we've confused science with advocacy. I'm just gonna be real clear about that. I think a lot of our centers and a lot of our work are about advocating for particular positions, and they're not true to science. And I think that puts us in a really dangerous position as a field. And if you want your work to be meaningful and to be picked up and to have impact in the real world, to have impact to make our communities safer and to increase and enhance public safety and to make things fair and just, you still have to be true to science. You can't be an advocate and a scientist at the same time. You do the science and then you push to the right places to disseminate so that the advocacy work, which is very important, has the information that they need to do their work. And when we start crossing over those boundaries, I think we get ourselves into trouble. And in order to make that information available, that's where we have to stop thinking about what's valuable in the discipline. I left academia after 25 years. And my first new job, I can't access my own articles. Yeah, think about that. And then we want practitioners and community members and policymakers to be able to access our research. They literally can't. Even if they could, would they be able to understand it and disseminate it and use it?
Thank you for that, Robin. You raise an incredibly important point. I wonder if now that I'm not hearing the feedback, is the feedback gone? Great. Thomas, if I could toss to you with an encouragement to address what Robin has just said, there really has, I feel like in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, been a proliferation of university-based centers that are focused on very niche issues and have an explicit advocacy.
Where are we going with this?
An advocacy role, and how much is that really confusing, the science and the advocacy? I personally, and I'll try to make it a little easier for you personally, I don't think it's that difficult. I think you can do the science and then advocate for what comes out of your findings. You don't have to set yourself up as a place that is pushing for X or Y to Z to happen, which then, in my view, and not just mine, but all the policymakers that we have as part of our membership and that we all interact with every day, look at those things with a skeptical eye because they kind of get that there's a point of view being pushed. And talk on that, Thomas.
Sure. Well, I think it's interesting. I think that in some ways in my own thinking and in preparation for this, I sort of skipped over these questions. But it's really interesting because we are at a time where we're really questioning first principles. And it needs to be said out loud that before research can be anything, it needs to be independent and impartial and reliable and of high quality. And I find it remarkable that we need to say that out loud, but we do need to say that out loud. So thank you for reminding me of that. I'll just sort of speak in reference to my own career and something I've been thinking about for people who are interested in these interested in this field, which is I have been sort of focused on a particular problem on and off, and then very much intensively on for my entire career. And that's from my time as a high school teacher to all of my time in law enforcement and in politics and policy and academia. I am genuinely concerned about the problem, homicide, community gun violence, and those types of things. But I am also genuinely intellectually interested in whatever the solution may be. And one of the things that I see, both in the sort of practitioner space, but also in the research space, is many people say they're concerned with a problem, but they're actually advocates for a particular solution or a particular framework or a particular framing or terminology or those things. And that's incentivized within the academy. And I would urge folks to take sort of the longer view, which is throw yourself intellectually against a particular problem again and again and again. Be genuinely interested in whatever evidence tells you. And I think that is a sort of a durable way to cope with the sort of ever-changing nature of the field.
Adam, just if I'm just may,
Of course.
talk about whether there's an impact policy. How does things get changed through voting? We haven't done a good job of reaching out to the people in our community who votes. If people see a DA on the ballot, how do they know what issues to go for? And we talk about the misinformation out there, right, that comes in the way, and we see people get into office based on this misinformation. It's our job to combat and stamp out ignorance. And we hadn't really done a good job based on some of the barriers that we talked about, the lack of incentives, reaching out and informing our citizens, informing our voters, and making sure that they have all the quality information that they need. And so I think, oftentimes in the research, we forget about the people we're researching. We just turn them into data points, and we lose the humanity in it. And I think if we are able to contact and reach out to these voters through alternative measures and alternative publications, that we can maybe even see the things that we're talking about in policy being moved forward through our electoral process.
Thad, I put Thomas on the spot a second ago. I'm going to put you back on here. You're talking about how voters don't have enough information as they should to make good decisions about these things. I'll put to you that students who are studying these things don't have the information that they need to be good citizens on this. And I'm putting you on the spot because you've said many times that your own students are not aware of many of the key trends that are happening in the field, including one that you have well documented along with Bill, your colleague at Georgia State University, Bill Sable. And I should have said at the outset, apologies that Bill was not able to make it. He was on your program to be with us today. But I hope everybody's aware that Bill and Thad have done some really groundbreaking research with us at CCJ on trends in racial disparities, and found over 20 years now, since 2000, that there have been pretty significant reductions in overall disparities in imprisonment and fairly significant reductions in particular parts of the system and angles of it. For instance, a 75% reduction in the drug imprisonment disparity for drug offenses, and near parity on several other points, including parity with respect now to the rate at which blacks and whites are revoked to prison for technical violations of parole. Your students, though, think, I've characterized this problem as a problem that's gone from worse to bad. And yet I think most of your students are going to think there's a problem that's getting from bad to worse. It's just a growing problem, and nothing's getting better. There's not been any progress. Why is that? And how come that particular piece of this, which I think speaks very much to the credibility of the field with policymakers, why is that happening?
So, that's very disappointing. I'm often discouraged. I'll ask a room full of criminal justice majors, and this is not just in my students, but students at other campuses. Are things getting better or worse when it comes to equity between black and white people in the justice system? Didn't say things were perfect, but that all things were solved, but are they getting better? And everybody said nobody raises their hand. And I break down the research to them, the literature, and because, academia can kind of be left-leaning, and we can attract left-leaning perspectives. And you have people who are motivated, who are passionate, who self-selected into this major. But I think that, it's often the emotion taints the evidence. And even it's so much of a level of mistrust of our systems, even among our own students, that how can we lift up this major? How can we lift up this practice? And I think part of it is that we're not in the news. We're not on social media. We're not at places where they can find us. Never will I say it's somebody else's responsibility. It's our responsibility. We have talents. We have skills. And oftentimes I think I'm not doing a fair enough job, but it's much bigger than who and what we are. Think about the societal backdrop we have, the racialized backdrop. Think about the politicized backdrop. Hell, I don't even know what equity is in this type of backdrop, right? And so I think for many of our students, they're just as confused. And we have to present research in a way where they can actually understand. They don't care about your econometric models. They don't care about how many pounds you can put together. What they care about is how does it impact human lives. And I think, part of it is our job, but another part is just the society that we live in. And if we have professionals coming up who can't get past their own emotions and their own thoughts and focus on evidence, realizing that with doing so, it's not about you, it's about the lives that you're impacting, we might be in trouble. And I think it's important that, and one more thing, Adam, I'll talk about this, we talk about the research. This research found that racial disparities were decreasing. Do you know how hard it was to get coverage? Now, if I said racial disparities was going up tenfold, oh my God, I'd still be answering calls right now. And so we have to be willing to accept that. And part of it is that we know who was in presidency over some of the years that we saw this decline. And we take our politics and our emotion and it taints it. And I've heard students say those things. Well, I don't believe it. This guy's in office. This can't be the case. But the evidence is there. And you try to break down and explain to them, yes, half of the reduction that we see in disparities is because of population changes. But there's something going on in the other half that we can be encouraged about. And so I'm not sure how to get past that, but I know that it is often heartbreaking because I know they mean well. But for some reason, the story is out there that things are not getting better, that people are not doing work. People are working and been working. And it's almost a slap in the face of those people doing those jobs.
Thanks, Dad. Robin, you want to jump in on that?
Well, I'll just...
If not, do you want to talk about that? Because I think we need to follow up on that. Thomas, did you have somewhere you wanted to take that?
I just think there's a tension between incremental reforms and transformative change. And I think that for those who are passionate about transformative change, to acknowledge the success of incremental reforms is threatening. And I think that's a real challenge in the field, but it's really just a microcosm of the larger polarization we're seeing all across society. And I think we all need to be sort of thoughtful about how we deal with this polarization and this overwhelming pressure, not just to pick a side, but to pick the most forceful, most extreme version of that side. I think about that a lot. And I think that that's a real challenge when, our primary contribution as academics is impartial unbiased information. There are other people who do advocacy very well. And that doesn't mean that none of us engage in advocacy. Of course we do. I do sometimes. But I think that it's important to understand that unless we are producing high quality, impartial information, that is our primary purpose. And then I think the question is how does that engage in the broader marketplace of ideas, not just our marketplace of ideas?
Go ahead, Robin.
I'd like to take on the concept about the students and the young folks, right? So, you know what? They're passionate. I was actually so excited to see some of the protests. I really was, because I thought they care about something. They're going to the street and they're demanding something. We had a lost generation in there. They didn't care about anything, right? You couldn't get them to be excited or interested about anything. So now they're going to the streets and they're bringing lots of other folks with them. But they're going to the streets uninformed. And I recognized this when all of a sudden the students were protesting me. I'm the head of a law enforcement agency. My first day on the job, outside my office with a sign was students saying, Robin Engel has blood on her hands. Okay? And so then what happens? Dr. Tamara Harold's sitting right up here in the front row. She's been talking about non-aspirational reform. And this is what we've gotten to. We've gotten to things that we can yell out of a megaphone, bullet points of how we want, in particular, the police to reform. And here's my list of 8 can't wait, and here's my list, and here's my list of demands. I've gotten list of demands from students of things that we need to do. 3/4 of the things on those lists are not evidence-based or informed. Okay? Majority of them will have very little to no impact on long-term reform. So how do we manage that excitement and not really excitement, but the passion and people who really care about these issues and harness that and inform it in ways that will be powerful for long-term change? That's what we really need to do as an academy, as educators. We don't want to dampen that spirit. I have a daughter who's a sophomore in college. I'm like, go protest, right? Yeah, but go informed. Know what the hell you're protesting about and what you want as a solution, and make sure that it's evidence-based. This is the same child that I would not let go to DARE. You had to sign the form in the 4th grade. She came home and said, Mommy, will you sign my form? I said, no, it's not evidence-based. She said, please, Mommy, all the other kids are going. I said, all right, I'll sign the form, but I won't like it. Okay.
I love that you brought up DARE. We just had a meeting of Council on Criminal Justice members, and we had a whole session on what is evidence these days. I mentioned at the top that we're undergoing some fundamental shifts in the field about what counts as evidence and what should be the relative weight of traditional empirical evidence versus experiential evidence of practitioners, but certainly of people in communities. And I'm sure everybody in this room is well aware that there's a long overdue and welcome movement to ask people in communities what they want, and that the solutions are to be found in the knowledge and wisdom of people who are experiencing problems on a daily basis in their lives. So the real question comes in when the community says we want DARE.
Right.
So how would you think about it, Robin, if you want to keep going, how do you think about when and I realize the definitional piece here gets tricky, but traditional empirical evidence and the way you describe it conflicts with community preferences?
Well, this just happened in our research, because one of the big police reform demands is for implicit bias training. We're going to train those cops not to be biased. We're going to do implicit bias training. And we have no evidence in the field of policing that implicit bias training will actually change police behavior. And so what we have now is a group of folks saying, well, we don't really need to change their behavior. Maybe just changing their attitudes or improving their knowledge is okay. And if you are a police administrator, are you going to stand up and say, no, I'm not doing implicit bias training with my cops because there's no evidence to show that it'll have a change in their behavior? No police executive in their right mind is going to stand up and say that unless they're sheriff. Those county sheriffs, I don't know what they do. I mean, sometimes I'm just like, really? Did you say that out loud? Okay. But the point is, of course, there is a push and a demand for that. When I was there, that was one of the first things I did was implicit bias training, because it builds confidence in the police. It builds their legitimacy, even if that training doesn't have the outcome, one outcome, which is behavioral change. But it could have an outcome of cultural change within the police agency that just takes a really long time to measure and to come into fruition, right? That's possible. It could also impact citizens' perceptions of legitimacy of the police. And so that's why thinking about multiple outcomes of success and how we measure what that looks like is really, really important. And so I wouldn't want to shortchange things and say, well, that doesn't work, so you shouldn't do it. That's not true, but think about what it is impacting or what it could possibly impact. 8 hours of training of cops is not going to change their behavior long term. I can tell you that, but it could change some other things, and we need to take a look at it.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to jump in or add on this?
Yeah, I might have a polite disagreement over the utility of implicit bias training. I think we always have to remember that we have scarce resources, and if we're choosing one thing, we're not choosing another thing. And I also think it's important that we be somewhat rigorous in saying when we study something, we have an hypothesis that it's going to achieve a certain outcome. If it doesn't achieve that outcome, you can go fishing for other outcomes, and you can do that. But you should be transparent about the initial outcome that it wasn't successful. I just want to go back to this sort of question of the nature of evidence, and I have to say I find this a bit exhausting, because I think there's a relatively straightforward answer, which is that there is a continuum of evidence, and different evidence is important at different stages in the sort of research pipeline. I think that qualitative evidence, that participatory evidence, that working with impacted people with lived experience, practitioners who are out there doing it in the real world, all of those things are incredibly important to influence what questions you ask and how you ask them. They're incredibly important at the very beginning of this research process. And as you get further and further down the research process, I think you move to increasingly more rigorous and more quantitative methods. And at the end, what you're looking for are very rigorous methods, with a large amount of internal and external validity in multiple studies. And I think we argue as if we're always at either one stage or at another. And so I'm very much in favor of mixed methods. And I think I think we should be able to hold in our mind the idea that qualitative, potentially narrative information can be extremely valuable and used as evidence, and at the same time understand that there are certain methods that produce strong conclusions about causality. And we should be able to embrace both of those things.
Yeah, let me just jump in, because it's not just one policy; it's a suite of policies, right? And also, this is real life, right? So RCT is the gold standard. Well, if I'm struggling with housing, if there's syringes on the ground, if the school has a high expulsion rates, if there's high violence rates, I don't give a damn about an RCT. I need some relief right now, or I need to feel like there is some relief. So think about crime. Just talk about real life. If I'm a mayor and the people are afraid of crime, I know that beefing up patrols may not do anything for crime, but guess what? People sure feel better. Their fear of crime controls if you go out to the store at night. The fear of crime controls whether you go to businesses, whether businesses come and want to invest in communities, right? And so I think we have to take an approach that, well, listen, and just be honest, this may not impact crime, but your citizens will feel safer. But while you're doing that, we have other ways with targeted hotspots policing, not just, making places, criminalizing places all day. Most places are only highly criminal, maybe part of the day. So targeting on space and time, right? But also want to beef it up because citizens feel better and they feel safer. That's important, and we can't downplay that. And so I think, we have to understand that optics is an important part of public safety. right? And we have to do something oftentimes, but what is it you can do right now that doesn't have any backfire effects and make things worse? But at least make your citizens feel safer while we pass on another suite of policies and changes and tactics that may have that more middle and long-term impact. So it's difficult because it's real life and you're dealing with people.
Thank you. I'm going to tell a quick story and ask you guys for your reactions to it. And then we have about a half an hour left, and would love to get to some questions. I think we have some mics that'll get around, so we're going to definitely have a good chunk of time for some Q&A, so be thinking of your questions if you haven't already. So my story is this. A few years ago, it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was riding around here in Atlanta with my wife doing errands, and the phone rings, and it just says South Carolina on it. And the person on the other end said, "Hey, Adam, it's Laura." I have not spoken with Laura in years. She's an advocate in South Carolina. And she said, "All the judges around here are now talking about how they're not going to sentence anybody to more than 5 years in prison because there's a study that's out that says that sentencing people to more than 5 years in prison," and this is her word, "was counterproductive." And she says, I thought you would know what study this is. And I said, honestly, I don't think there is such a study, and I don't quite see how a study could fix a certain number of years, but only look into it. Well, my wife heard my half of the conversation and asked me out. And she's, I think I saw something on this. And it took about a day or two for her to recall that there had been a front page story in the New York Times about a former federal inmate who has really done well for himself in life. He's a lawyer. I think a lot of people here would know who I'm talking about. And in the story, there was a passage in which this person had written to his sentencing judge as an inmate, and they struck up a dialogue. And at some point in their communication, the guy says, I think it's counterproductive to sentence people to more than 5 years in prison. And that was the source of what was being bandied about in a courthouse as a study and sort of evidence that this isn't right. But why? There's so much to that, and I think it draws in a lot of what we've been talking about here. Sort of what is evidence? How do practitioners and policymakers interpret the information that they get? But why is it that something that it may have some basis in what people believe or want to believe, and so they interpret it that way. But why is it that it's kind of that easy for non-evidence to make its way quickly into practice, and so difficult for often much more rigorous research to have that same kind of?
Well, that's really a question about the media and not a question about the academy. And it involves questions of novelty bias, negativity bias. It involves the 24-hour news cycle, all of those different things, all of the pressures on media to do whatever it can to get as many clicks, likes, eyeballs, and things like that. And I think that's a separate discussion from what we're doing here. I think the question for academics, recognizing that reality, is how do you interact with a system like that? And I think that one of the tensions, one of the fundamental tensions that we have is the timeliness issue. Today, important public questions can be raised, framed, and answered on social media and in the 24-hour news cycle in one day. And if you are not participating on that day, you've missed your opportunity. And I think that's an immense challenge for academics. And I think the issue, and I think the proper response is not to try to speed up our research in some unbelievably unrealistic way and destroy the quality of our work. But once our work is completed, everything has to be summarized in an incredibly succinct way and organized in a way so that you can pick it up, hand it to a reporter, hand it to a policymaker, and quickly. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is our work is not done once it is simply published. It has to be prepared to be synthesized and to be communicated in a variety of places. So if you don't, I would urge all of you, if you think some of your work is important and relevant to policy, and you don't have a one-pager on that is written in clear, accessible language, go back and have that in your back pocket, your virtual back pocket, for when you get asked by someone who doesn't have a lot of time, doesn't have a lot of attention, but has a lot of influence, what you think about a subject.
Yeah, just like we've embraced mixed methodology, we have to embrace mixed dissemination methodology, right? And just sending out that journal article is not enough. And it's on all of us, right? If we want to be relevant as an academy, if we want to be relevant, then we have to change our methods as well and be willing to try to enter that crazy news cycle, because that's where people are getting their information. And so thinking that through, how do we collectively help one another to do that? I think is, something we need to be thinking through.
Yeah. Again, I've had the fortune of, Rick Rosenfeld and Richard Wright were two of my mentors. And the one thing they taught me about, market your research. Get your research out there. Why are you doing this research? And so part of it is marketing your research, getting it out there. Whether you're doing it because you want to claim or whether you want to impact lives, get it out there. And I think, the timeliness issue, Adam is always, if something happens, like, listen, man, we got to get something out there and we need to, and I'm like, but it makes sense because this is what we're up against. We're up against that news cycle. We're up against social media. We're up against misinformation. And I keep going back like a broken record, accessibility to our work in a way that the public can understand it. That a police leader, like, man, what I can do, I only have 5 minutes. I can look through, I see this is promising, I'll follow up. And so I think it's about accessibility, how we write. I've had Adam, many times I'll give him something like, this is great that if you go into Crim or another journal, but we're trying to impact these people. And, and not being what I call myself an egghead professor, right? And so part of it is understanding language. Part of it is knowing that we're up against this cycle and that we need to find ways to disseminate this information via social media. One paragraphers, we said one page, one paragraph in the time frame that we're in right now, where we can provide a counterbalance. And also accessibility. When somebody sees something, I know Georgia State has this, or I know ASC on their site, they have a list of open access things that I can go to and verify these things because they're reputable. And I just think it's just these, it's not necessarily big, profound things we can do. It's these smaller things that we can do to make sure that the good evidence is made available and that people have an option.
Well, that's been an awfully consistent theme throughout this conversation about how you present and package your work and how it's going to land. I mean, the spirit of that story in question, I think, was a little bit also about the way individual stories and people's sort of testimony and experience land versus how data lands. And I wouldn't for a second pit one against the other, but I think it's interesting to think about how to animate the data with stories as well, right? It's a sort of common tactic in polling. And if you're looking at the way news media covers polls, they will report the overall data, and then they'll find somebody who was a respondent to the poll who brings to life that particular perspective. That's the majority perspective, or maybe the minority as well. And maybe there's something in there as well. It's not sort of just the facts, man, but it's actually in talking to people in communities who can bring those results to life. Thomas, go ahead, and then we'll get to Q&A.
I don't know, maybe this is an interesting anecdote, but this issue was raised very directly for me in the writing of my book, Bleeding Out. And early when I was shopping the idea, in particular looking for agents, having decided to write this, having decided that it would be a trade book and not an academic book, I had a lot of interest from agents who wanted to fundamentally sort of change the book. In that, they said, this is interesting, exciting stuff, but I don't think I can sell it. You need to change it to a story about people that illustrates the ideas. And I thought about that, and I decided that was something that I fundamentally was not willing to do, because I really believed that the ideas themselves were the most powerful thing. And so I went back to those people and ultimately worked with an agent who accepted this. And I said, look, the ideas come first. I'm willing to do whatever I can to make these ideas as accessible, interesting, or whatever. But the book must lead with the ideas. I think we should lead with the evidence, lead with the research, lead with the data, but then be willing to communicate it in a way that's most accessible. I think it's a balance, and I think it shifts depending on your audience. How you talk to one audience is not how you talk to another. But I think ultimately our value is that we are bringing ideas, and we need to be faithful to those ideas.
Thank you. Questions from the group? Is that Rick?
Great discussion. So I'm also been thinking a lot about how the word gets out, right? It's, I think, useful to compare our field and its translational capacity with other fields, So think of news about chemistry, news about biology, and so forth. What the chemists and biologists, what the so-called hard scientists have available to them are these news brokers. They have science writers, right, who are able to take the work, understand the work, and then translate it into language that people will find accessible. Think of economists, right? They get the word out, not in an unmediated way typically, but because of their brokers. Paul Krugman is a good example, but there are lots of business writers who have some background in the field, but they're not Paul Krugman. And so what we don't have in our field is the equivalent. Every once in a while, a Jill Leovy will come around, right? But it's not institutionalized in our field to have a crime and justice writer or a suite of crime and justice writers, because leaving it just up to us to generate the one-pager and keep it in the virtual back pocket, that's a good idea, but frankly, a lot of us don't know how to write in anything other than academic ease, right? And so that's the missing link, I think, in part, and that's in part the reason why our word doesn't get out as much as the word of other disciplines.
Yeah. I guess as the former reporter on the panel, I'll try to take that, which is, and Thomas, I'll go to you, if that's the case, we're at a real impasse, because as you well know, Rick, and everybody else, that journalism has really collapsed. Even before it had collapsed, when I first moved here to Atlanta in 1987, the way it worked then and the way it works now is that the crime beat is the lowest rung on the totem pole. You're the newest kid on the block. You don't know anything about crime. You don't know anything about policing. You don't know anything about all these issues, because it's the worst job. Literally at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 1 at night, listen to the police scanner, watch the 11 o'clock news, and chase around the TV stations, for making sure that we don't miss a story about a murder. And then people, all they want to do is get off that beat and move on to City Hall or something more sexier, I guess, in some ways. That is still the dynamic, and you have a press corps that is a fraction of the size that it was then, let alone at the sort of more cerebral level that you talk about here. So it'll be a while before, maybe a long while before we get that kind of intellectual capacity, I think, in this field, given that dynamic. And so I'd put the onus back on the field significantly in that equation. Thomas?
I don't know. Maybe I come out somewhere in the middle. I don't think that I don't think the expectation is that everyone should be all things to all people. Mm-hmm. I think that you do need to be able to communicate to multiple audiences. If you're not skilled at that, that just means you need to have partners. And I agree that these translational, I perform a translational role a lot in my own work. I think that we need to, and I think the answer is not necessarily that everyone becomes an effective communicator to all of these different audiences, but that we appreciate that, and as you said, that we uplift and value people who can do that, and the sort of ambassador role. So I'm more optimistic about that, and I think that I think it may be unrealistic to expect all these skill sets in one person.
Thanks. Ellen, do you have a question?
Okay. Hi. Thank you, guys. Lots of great insight. A lot of stuff about communication. I found myself nodding quite a bit. And it's because, you know, if you go back to the beginning, when you had said, think about a time when research broke through. And Thomas, you had shared the Martinson report. And I think, again, we all nodded. And we said in 1974, Martinson put out this report that said nothing works. My PhD exam was, well, what if he was wrong? That was my exam. 30-something pages later, I finally had my degree, right? But I think we all can find ourselves in a place where we look back and say, wow, cringe, cringe. But he said it at a time when people were ready to hear it, right? He didn't usher that change alone. It was the mid-70s. It was a time when people were ready to hear that we should stop having the rehabilitative model, that we should stop having the medical model, lock them up, tough on crime. So today we're in a different place. And so my question to you all is, what are they ready to hear? What is the place we're in now if we're talking about the future of crime policy? What place are we now? I'm a practitioner, so for the researchers, the academics in the room, what should they be looking towards messaging in order to have the biggest impact with our work?
Oh, this is great. This is great. And so I'll just kind of share this, and this is coming with the racial disparities report. There were conversations about knowing that the political backdrop in the times that we're in. Like I've heard people that have worked, in think tanks or in places like Westat and things like this, when they're applying for money, if there's a right-wing person in office, they talk about it through the lens of offending. If it's a left-wing person in office, they talk about it through a lens of victimization. And so we have to play that game, unfortunately. Even when the report came out about, we said racial disparities are shrinking in our justice system. Well, we were like, well, this backdrop, should we say that things are getting worse for white people? And so you have to make those calculations and understand the backdrop of what sells. What's that hook, like a good song, right? It doesn't matter the verses, it's that hook. How do we hook them in? And I think, sometimes we have to look at ourselves and see, are we willing to play that game? We didn't go that route because we weren't willing, I think, necessarily to play that game in that moment, but we had to consider it. And I'm not sure if I'm asking your question, but that's the creative mind where you collaborate with others. The great thing about working with the council, they have people much smarter than me, can write better than me. I can open my mouth up, and they'll say something, it actually makes sense. Or they understand the pulse, because I don't necessarily understand the political and social pulse because I'm embedded in academia, whereas people beside me more so, and so I team up with them. But it's understanding, how do I write that hook? I also build the relationships with reporters, right? We can no longer be afraid of reporters. I slide stuff to reporters all the time, right? And and they appreciate that, right? And we often see that we are trying to accomplish the same goal. And so I think how you frame, given the political backdrop at the times, and also making those relationships with people and reporters who can make things a little bit sexier than we can. Go ahead, Rob.
I would say right now actually is a time for us to be brave and say things that might otherwise not say. So I'm going to try one right now. We'll see how I do. Yes, the racial and ethnic disparities have been going down in prisons and in many parts of the criminal justice system. But my concern in policing, and focusing specifically on policing, is that policing becomes more and more evidence-based. And we focus on repeat offenders and repeat victims and repeat places. And we have less of a footprint, and we do less harm. We're actually potentially going to increase racial and ethnic disparities. It's an actual math problem, right? It's pretty much simple math. And that is, the more you focus on repeat offenders, the more likely you are going to run into racial and ethnic disparities. And it's because, of course, we all know that that's a larger system, right? It's education and housing and mental health and a whole host of other things that are disparate. And when we then focus the police on your goal is to reduce racial and ethnic disparities. And in some places, in some jurisdictions, city of Austin, great example, city ordinance that was passed requiring racial and ethnic disparities in policing outcomes to be 0. As a police executive, it's not realistic because so thinking through and in this policy environment right now, who's going to stand up and say that maybe our outcomes that we measure for success, particularly in police reform, is overall volume of reduction in harm, of reduced footprint overall across racial groups, knowing that we might actually see an increase in racial and ethnic disparities, but that doesn't mean that we're not moving in the right direction. But you can't say that in this environment right now, although I just did. Can I get a police escort out?
I got you. I don't have my weapon, so we have to run real fast.
And that goes to your question, right? Is that it's who's ready to receive the messages from academia, and are we as a collective group brave enough to continue to stick with the science and with what we know, and continue to push building that knowledge base and putting it out there? And I don't know the answer, whether or not we as a collective group are willing to take that on.
Well, let me offer a cautious, maybe even naive note of optimism. We've seen, I think, the limits of ideologically driven policy in criminal justice. I think we saw it a few years ago with the sort of the high water mark of the abolitionist movement, which I think is waning now. And I also think we've seen the limitations of fear-based, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly racist demagoguery in the run-up to the midterm elections. Mm-hmm. So maybe, just maybe, there's a window here for solutions, not slogans, and for a little bit more of our evidence-based thinking, and a little bit more of a space to ask these tough questions and to challenge the ideology. So that's my hope.
I want to build on that just really quickly to say I think that the way to research used to be about how do we reduce crime. It's now focused, I think, shifted substantially to how do we reduce incarceration. And when you talk about wanting to have impact in a policy arena right now, especially right now, and as we've had the increase in crime, particularly homicide, talking to policymakers going forward, the analyses have got to pay attention to both sides of that coin. When folks think that the sole goal is to reduce incarceration without attending to the crime side of the equation, you're gonna find a lot of closed ears and doors. I think, do we have one more time for one more quick question? And I wanted to leave time for some closing statements here. Ma'am? He's... Go ahead.
Right here.
Sorry.
Hi.
Sorry.
I'll be quick with my question. I'm James Pratt, a new professor at Fisk University. And my question kind of pushes this envelope a little bit. We know that with reform and conversations around reform, we inherently reinforce the institution that we're talking about as they get better, what have you. And so I want to push this question about having blood on our hands, because many of us in this room do in fact have blood on our hands when it comes to reinforcing systems of harm. So how do you all lean into the research on creating new institutions, research around abolition and defunding, because there's a lot of reform conversation and we tiptoe around those conversations, but don't lean into creating the new institutions with the evidence, both qualitative, quantitative, in these areas?
That's a great question. I'll take it first and then pass it along to my colleagues. There's been, of course, such a push right now for community-based violence intervention, having, public health space stepping in and taking calls away from police, for example, those kinds of things. And so our research is actually looking at the implementation of those types of alternatives to policing and to the criminal justice system, and looking for just also implementation, but also outcome measures. Is this effective? What does this look like? And so I think that we as a collective, we can pivot just as well while we're looking at a criminal justice system that exists, it's here, right? And thinking through how we can better that system in place. But as alternatives are springing up and there's innovation in communities, that we can also provide the research around those perspectives. And it's really such a shame right now that community violence intervention is not well studied, right? We have a lot of information about police-led strategies for violence intervention and what that looks like in violence reduction. We have a body of evidence there, but we don't when we're looking at community-based intervention programs. And I think that's starting to change. You're seeing some funding initiatives that are coming out there. So I do think that we can pivot and still bring the research to bear.
Yeah. Thomas, I can kind of set you up if you don't mind real quickly. Let me say, I appreciate saying that we all have blood on our hands. And the first conversation I had with one of my mentors at Georgia State was how we've been talking about these communities, dealing with crime, abject poverty, how we dehumanize them, how we made things worse. And so, first of all, reframing how we discuss these communities, right? That it's not the people, it's systemic inequities. And I think the same thing when it comes to violence. You know, one, as a black man, I saw a finding that, okay, for drugs and property crimes, when it comes to arrest leading to imprisonment, that's because of differential treatment. But we also have to be honest about how certain communities have been let down systemically, and that we have to create systems to restore them systemically that create these conditions that we see. And I think that we are starting to people be honest about the limits of the criminal justice system, because the justice system is a punishing and blaming institution. And we've asked them to be all these other things. And so I think the conversations, and Thomas has done work on this, talking about empowering communities and moving toward a system of people policing themselves and preventing these crimes and violent prevention work groups, investing in schools, these things that maybe we're investing in the wrong aspects. And so I have seen, not fast enough and haven't pivoted as hard enough, but we are moving in that direction, understanding that the justice system is a part of public safety, but it's not the end all be all. And I hope that is kind of what you're kind of addressing in that statement. So I do appreciate your point.
I'm probably not the best person to ask about how to advance abolitionism. I'm a reformist, not an abolitionist. But I think that one of the things, and I remember when I was at Harvard, I had students who would sort of, come to me and sort of be critical. And they were like, this is all small ball stuff, this is all sort of, nibbling around the edges. When are we going to get to the really big questions? And I think that you have to be humble about what your position is. I have a career that's been, based on engaging with the system, and I have lots of thoughts. Hopefully they're useful about improving the system in small ways. I think you have to sort of decide whether you want to be sort of an inside the room player or an outside the room player. Both are very valuable. Inside the room, people are making compromises, making decisions, and those things. Outside the room, the people, you can hear the shouts for, broad, bolder, stronger change. And it empowers the inside the room people to push for more. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's value in these things. And I would say one of the things that I hope we're seeing is a broader conception of public safety, that public safety is not just law enforcement. But I worry that in the conversation about how we scale up the community-based side of that, the non-enforcement side of that, that we're positioning that as an alternative, and it's actually a complement to those things. And actually, they need to be in conversation with one another. That's what I believe. We might have a respectful disagreement, but I think it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I did promise panelists time for closing statements. We're actually right at time, so go.
I stood up at the Major City Chiefs meeting and the Police Executive Research Forum, and I told an entire group of police executives that they have a moral and ethical responsibility to use evidence-based practices. I needed an escort out of that room too. I'm going to stand up, say to this room, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to be better in the academy. We have to engage in research that's relevant for practitioners and for communities. We need to have policy implications that are more than just a paragraph at the end of your article. We need to have and establish relationships with practitioners and community members and advocates and the media in order to have a voice. And we need to think about implementation science. We heard Nancy Levine talk about this yesterday. It's so critically important. We've really overlooked it. And we need to know why things work and not just what works. And collectively, I think we can get there. But if we don't, I fear that we're a dying breed, quite honestly. And I think we will become irrelevant. So I challenge you all, join us and help continue to push that evidence base forward.
Yeah, and I'm just, you said everything I want to say so great. I can say 2 lines if you're done. This is great. No, I appreciate this. I will say that I think that many of us in the room, we have the heart and the desire to do so, but we're only human. And many of the things that we want to do are not incentivized. And so I want to challenge leaders, not just in the crim departments, but at academia, to create internal grant programs, to evaluate differently, allow your researchers to be innovative and dare to be bold and not worry about having pretty p-values at the end of it. Those who want to put together data sets that allow researchers like us to be able to mine and run regressions and all the things that we do, we need to uplift that work. We need to also uplift qualitative work, because without qualitative work, we can't get new innovative survey measures. And so I think if we are to do those things and have those incentives there, where I'm not worried about a publication having sexy values, but I know that a 0 finding is a finding. And if we promote that, I think that we'll be much better off.
I think my co-panelists said it all.
Thomas, I have never seen you decline an opportunity to speak before, so I appreciate that. I won't keep you any longer. Just want to say this is kind of how we roll at CCJ. We try to have serious, honest conversations about tricky and tough conversations and issues without demonizing people who disagree. And I know we didn't get to all the aspects of this really complicated and deep question here today, but I really just want to thank the panel and thank you all for being here, and ASC for giving us the opportunity.